Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming tonight. Bob Martin and Nina Weiss and I really want to welcome you to this second in a series, election year, the Festival of Optimistic Voices. And tonight we brought to you another set of three of the world's great visionaries. And they're going to be presenting to you their sort of cutting-edge thinking, their sort of paradigm-shifting perspectives, and their bigger-ticket solutions to some of the great problems of our time. Last month, for those of you who were here, the theme, you'll recall, was health, healing, and medicine power. And tonight the theme is about living in a win-win world. And each of our speakers is going to be speaking to that theme in really quite different but synergistic ways. And then following these talks, the ever-funny and deeply moving Nina Weiss will do one of her signature performances, improvised performances, where she'll sort of transform the discourse of the evening into something bizarre and probably beautiful.
I want to really talk about growing the green economy, because that's coming on very strong all over the world, and it's really our best way forward, I believe. What I would like to talk about really is transformation, because I think the change we're going through now is so much deeper. And we're talking about economic transformation, financial transformation, and really the transformations going on and accelerating all over the planet. And so I look at all of our domestic issues. They're now symptoms, really, of this new situation. You know, whether it's global warming or peak oil or the rise of Asia, the integration of Latin America, this is what's driving what we are dealing with domestically. Rising gas prices, the falling dollar, housing foreclosures, the meltdown going on Wall Street, the need to reform there. All of these things, I think, are symptoms of this new situation, that the USA is no longer the world's lone superpower. And it seems that it really is a good idea for us to get real about this. And another big change in the world is that currencies, rather than guns, are the 21st century weapons of choice. If you see what's happening in this tightly interlinked global financial system, instead of the old weapons, what's happening now is that countries all over the world who disapprove of U.S. policies simply sell dollars and buy euros or other currencies. And as we know, they've now got such a huge stash of dollars that they can go around the world buying up assets, oil and minerals, and even, of course, our companies. And they're now rescuing our banks. Now, next one, please. So what's the good news here? Well, I think it's good news that the USA can no longer act as the world's policeman. I think Ron Paul was right. And that trying to do that, we are just destroying our own economy. And so the other piece of good news is that it's becoming clearer to everybody that international cooperation is now the only way. We know it's difficult, doing treaties and all of this. But the problem is that all of these issues that are global can only be solved cooperatively. No nation alone can solve any of these global problems. And I think it's really good news that military force is getting less and less effective. And you even hear generals now going on TV and telling us this. They say, there's no military way to deal with Iraq, for example. There's no military way to deal with many of these problems that we have today. And even those generals are talking now on, its focus is how do we win the peace. What's exciting to me is that there's all of this reappraisal going on of Charles Darwin and the way he was misinterpreted and kind of hijacked by the economists in Britain in the 18th century, with this idea that nature is red in tooth and claw and all that, and so we have to have an economy based on those ideas. And actually, this reevaluation of Darwin shows that he clearly understood that the human species' success is actually based on the evolution of human emotional capacity for bonding. As you probably know, that's the hormone oxytocin. And really our success, if you look at it everywhere in the world, it really is that we are cooperative creatures. And Darwin really thought that we would be evolving toward altruism. The new economic paradigm looks like this cake. And basically, it's only the top two layers of the cake, that's the private sector and the public sector, that are measured in money terms and added up into the GDP. And completely left out of the economic textbooks up to now are those two important lower layers of the cake, which support the whole thing. And the third layer down I call the love economy. That's the 50% of all productive work that is done all over the world, which is unpaid and therefore unnoticed and not added up in GDP, which is only a money-denominated indicator. And of course, the whole cake rests on the productivity of Mother Nature, and that also is left out of those economic textbooks. So not surprisingly, if only the money transactions are added up into our main scorecard of progress, the gross national product, gross domestic product, what we have is a kind of steering mechanism which is taking us over a cliff. And you can't see it in the numbers because we're missing those two bottom layers of the cake and all of that productivity, which in the case of the love economy, we should be adding to GDP. And in the case of Mother Nature's bottom layer, we should be subtracting the environmental and social costs that we create with the current model. And of course, luckily, there are new indicators popping up all over the world, and as they are taken up, I'll talk about this in a minute, we are going to be steering companies and countries, in this much saner kind of direction. And so I think we see really at last that the area of finance is growing in terms of taking into account now environmental, social, and ethical reporting. I've been involved as an advisor to the Calvert Group of mutual funds in Washington for many, many years, and so we decided to co-create these new indicators for the USA, the Calvert Hendersen Quality of Life Indicators, and those are updated regularly at calvert-henderson.com. And what we find now, which is really exciting, is all the many countries that are changing their scorecards of progress away from such money indicators as GDP and toward quality of life. And I've just listed some of those there from Frankfurt and Brazil and, of course, Bhutan with the gross national happiness. And I've been involved in that. They had another one up in Canada on the gross national happiness, which has caught the imagination of the press all over the world. And then I helped to organize a conference in the European Parliament last November called Beyond GDP, and it was really exciting. We had a full house. We had 700 members of Parliament and statisticians, and even the galleries were full. And then the U.S. Senate, just a few weeks ago, held hearings on rethinking GDP and whether that was the proper measure to use in the U.S. And so, really, this may sound esoteric, but when you change the rules, you begin to change the game. And when you change the scorecard, you begin to change the game. Thank you.
I open my closet door in the morning, I see a sign that says, "Good morning, beautiful business." And it's a reminder to me of just how beautiful business can be when we put our creativity and our care and our thought into producing a product or a service that our community really needs. When I see that sign, "Good morning, beautiful business," I think of my own business, and I think of the farmers out there in the fields picking organic fruits and vegetables to bring into town that day. And I think of the cows and the pigs and the chickens out there in fresh sunshine and fresh air. And I think of our goat herder, Dougie Newbald, that says when she kisses her goat's ears, it makes the cheese better. And I think that's true. And I think about the Zapatista Indians down in Chiapas growing the coffee beans, organic coffee beans that I'll have in my morning cup. Business is about relationships. Money is simply a tool. Business is about relationships with everyone that we buy from and sell to and work with, and about a relationship with Earth itself. My business is the way I express my love for the world, and that's what makes it a thing of beauty. Studies show that it was in the 1950s when there was this destruction of both the urban and the rural communities that people became separated through these housing projects and migration to the suburbs, when happiness in our society began to decline. And today it's said that we're less happy than we were in the 50s and less happy than our European counterparts. There was a time when I questioned my own success because I didn't have a chain of restaurants, and people would hear I'm a famous restaurateur and they'd say, "Well, how many restaurants do you have?" I'd say, "Well, I just have only one." But I made a conscious decision to stay small because I realized that if I grew beyond a certain point, that I would lose what was really most important to my own happiness, and that's the authentic relationships with all the people involved with my business. I came to understand that success could be measured in other ways than growing materially. We can grow by increasing our knowledge, by expanding our consciousness, developing our creativity, deepening our relationships, increasing our happiness and well-being, and having more fun. As author, activist Bill McKibben says, it's not about belongings, it's about belonging. This idea that it's not material belongings, but rather belonging to a community that brings happiness first occurred to me when living in an indigenous culture in 1969. Just after college, I was a VISTA volunteer in an Eskimo village in Alaska, where I began to see how cooperation, sharing, and community are the key to human survival. One spring morning, I heard a knocking on my cabin door, and I opened the door, and an Eskimo woman was saying, "Seal party, seal party." And I went outside, and I saw that all the women in the village were walking across the snow holding these buckets. And I followed along and soon learned that the tradition is that after a long, hard winter, when an Eskimo catches his first seal, his wife has a seal party and invites all the families over to the house where she divides the meat between all the families. And anything else that's accumulated during the year is also redistributed. The idea of hoarding more than one needs is unthinkable in Eskimo culture. Eskimos have no sense of envy. If I were to say to someone, I love that sweater you're wearing, if you were an Eskimo, you'd give me the sweater. So you have to watch out what you admire when you're around Eskimos. They couldn't conceive the concept of envy because they are committed to sharing and living cooperatively, and they have faith that the universe will provide everything that's needed. When I contrasted this to my own society, I realized that our consumer economy is actually based on envy. Advertising purposely creates envy, so we'll feel that we have to buy a new dress or makeup to look as good as the models in the ads, or we have to drink a certain kind of beer or smoke a certain kind of cigarette to look like those macho guys in the ads. In our society, we reward people who are greedy, and we actually admire the ones who hoard the most, the ones with the big gas-guzzling cars and the biggest houses and the largest wardrobes, using up the most natural resources. Advertising programs us to base our self-esteem on how much we have and make sure that we're never satisfied with what we have. The Eskimos were the happiest people I've ever met. They took great delight in life, and I think it's because their self-esteem and their security did not depend on money. It was community that provided their security. It was that sense of belonging. The Eskimos understood that all life is interconnected, that Earth's resources belong to everyone, and that we must share and cooperate in order to survive. They understood their place in the web of life. After reaching a sustainable size, including adding our retail store, the Black Hat, I stopped growing physically and began to grow in new ways, to grow deeper, using my creativity to design programs to educate and raise consciousness and build community and further our sense of interconnectedness with the other people in our community and with nature. Through our programs, we take our customers on solar house tours, teach them how to conduct energy audits of their homes, how biodiesel works. We take them on tours of farms and prisons and child watch tours to understand the lives of inner city children. We even take them to other countries to witness the effects of foreign policy, the U.S. foreign policy, on the lives of others. Some people accuse me that my real profession is that I use good food to lure innocent customers into social activism, which I think is probably true. We also grow by continually improving our business model. The other day, we just had our second annual Green Dog Day, when we talk about our environmental practices and announce anything new that we've done the year before. Last year, it was to introduce a composting project, and this year we put solar hot water panels on our roof to heat the water that we use for washing dishes. One of the most important and effective practices of the White Dog is to buy from local farmers, which is important in so many ways. For a long time, I knew the importance of buying cage-free chickens and eggs, but I didn't understand about the factory farming of pigs until I read John Robbins' book back in the 90s. There I learned about the barbaric way that pigs are raised in these crates where they can't move forward or backwards, they can't even turn around. They stand on cement with slats where their manure goes into a lagoon that goes on to pollute the water in the rural areas. They never have a breath of fresh air. They never feel sunshine. They're very social animals. They never can touch another pig. They can't sleep in big pig piles, as pigs love to do. The sows are artificially inseminated. Their babies are taken away prematurely, and then they're inseminated again over and over again as like they're a piece of machinery. But pigs are not machines. They're intelligent, sentient beings with emotions, like all mammals, like dogs, like people. I feel it's a violation of nature to treat them in this cruel and inhumane way. It's a betrayal of our sacred trust as stewards of farm animals. It's institutionalized cruelty that is destroying our own humanity. I realized that the pork I was using must be coming from this factory farm system, because most pork in our country does. And I realized that I just couldn't participate in this evil system, so I came in the kitchen and said, take all the pork off the menu, the bacon, the ham, the pork chops. I just couldn't stand the idea of being part of this. So our chef went about trying to see where we could get free-range pork, and talked to the farmer who was bringing in our free-range chicken, and he started bringing us in 2 pigs a week. The whole animals, we had to learn to use all the parts of the meat. Next, I discovered the terrible way that cattle and cows are raised in the industrial system, where they're actually herbivores, but we're taking them off pasture and forcing them to eat corn and wheat and even ground up animal parts. So we found sources for local grass-fed beef, and eventually all the meat and poultry at the White Dog came from small farmers where the animals are treated with respect and compassion. And I looked at my menu and thought, well, now I'm done. We're the only restaurant in Philadelphia where all of our products are from local farms, and this can be our market niche. There's no one else like us. I want to be the best and the only restaurant in town that could make that claim. But then I thought to myself, well, Judy, if you really did care about those pigs and cows and chickens, if you really did care about the small farmers that were being driven out by the big corporate farms, if you really care about the workers in those horrible slaughterhouses and industrial farms, and you cared about consumers that were eating meat full of hormones and antibiotics, then you would not keep this as your market niche, but rather share this information with your competitors. So that was a big turning point for me, because I realized that even though I was doing the right thing in my own company, that it wasn't enough, that there was no such thing as one sustainable business or one sustainable household, that we have to be a part of a sustainable system, that I needed to move from a competitive mentality to one of cooperation in order to build a whole local economy based on those values of humane and sustainable farming. So I asked the farmer who was bringing in our pork if he would like to expand his business, and he said yes. And I said, what's holding you back? And he said he needed $30,000 to buy a refrigerated truck so that he could deliver to many restaurants. So I loaned him the money, and he bought the truck. Then I increased the cafe's charitable giving from 10 to 20% and started our own nonprofit, White Dog Community Enterprises, and hired somebody whose job it was to go around to the other restaurants and teach them how to buy from farmers, not just the meat, but the fruits and vegetables. And so over the years, this has been about 7 years now, she's connected hundreds of farmers with restaurants and stores and built the local food system in our region. To summarize, the local living economy movement is about maximizing relationships, not maximizing profits. Growth of consciousness and creativity, not brands and market share. democracy and decentralized ownership, not concentrated wealth, a living return on our investments, not the highest return, a fair price, not the lowest price, sharing, not hoarding, simplicity, not gluttony, life-serving, not self-serving, partnership, not domination, cooperation-based, not competition-based, win-win exchange, not win-lose exploitation, family farms, not factory farms, biodiversity, not monocrops, cultural diversity, not monoculture, creativity, not conformity, slow food, not fast food, our bucks, not Starbucks, our mart, not Walmart, valuing life over lifestyle, and as the Earth Charter says, being more, not having more. At its heart, our movement for local living economies is about love, and it's love that can overcome the fear that many may feel in the hard days ahead brought on by climate change and environmental collapse. In my own experience, it was my love for animals that motivated me to challenge the factory farm system and begin building a local living economy in my region. Our power comes from protecting what we love of place, love of life, people, animals, nature, all of life on our beautiful planet Earth. And I would say for the entrepreneurs amongst us, it's also about a love of business. Business has been corrupted as an instrument of greed rather than one of service to the common good. Yet we know that business is beautiful when we put our creativity and care into producing a product or service needed by our community. A materialistic society has desensitized us to the suffering that underlies our industrial economic system. We're also desensitized by a false idea of masculinity based on control and domination. We need a more feminine, caring, nurturing approach to life to bring forth the goddess in each of us, men and women, to allow peace and harmony to come to our world. We must open our hearts and eyes and ears to hear the cry of the pigs in the crate, of the calf for her cow, of animals in laboratories, in the fur industry, to feel the suffering of men, women, and children enslaved in sweatshops, in the rug industry, in diamond and coal mines and chocolate production, the suffering of migrant workers in slaughterhouses and pesticide-soaked industrial farms, the suffering of the people of Iraq, of Nigeria, of the rainforest tribes, everywhere where there's oil and natural resources to exploit and fight wars over. Let us hear the cry of the whales, of the polar bears, of the trees, of the natural world dying all around us. What revives the energy and passion for all we must do in this movement is to simply to allow ourselves to love what we love, and in so doing, find our place as humans in the family of life. Thank you.
Well, thank you. 3 days ago, I was stabbed in the leg with a 5-inch dagger a few hundred yards from here. And I never thought I was able to be here this evening, and I'm very pleased I can be. And I'm here because after being attacked, I was looked after instantly by people at the conference in the La Fonda Hotel. I had the good fortune to be treated by a brilliant trauma surgeon, Dr. Cesar Ersic, and looked after incredibly well at St. Vincent's Hospital. I've also been visited continuously by people. I've been sent flowers, some of which are on the stage, including my organic tulips. I've had a feeling of being loved and cared for and prayed for. And I'm going to tell all my friends, if you ever need to get stabbed, Santa Fe is the place to have it happen. This evening, I'm not actually going to be talking about morphogenetic fields, morphic resonance, except for a part of the talk. Since it's called Optimistic Voices, I thought I'd try and talk on science and hope. And when we're thinking about the political and economic systems, we have to see that these are rooted in a much bigger system of ideas. They work within a larger framework. The ideas, the ideals, and the aspirations come first, and the political and economic systems work out the details and turn them into practical realities. And our present system of politics and economics is rooted in that huge revolution of thought in the 17th century, the scientific revolution. Science is central to our civilization, as it's not any other. And therefore it's very important to look at its nature, its role, and what it can do for the future of our civilization, and in what ways it can give us hope. The revolution of the 17th century was a revolution precisely because it overthrew a previous view of the world, and the view it overthrew, the view that was dominating Europe through the Middle Ages, was a view that said the universe is alive, the earth is a living planet, all animals and plants are truly living beings. The English word animal comes from the Latin word soul, anima, and the whole universe is interrelated, interconnected, and pervaded by spirit and as well as matter. That was the old view. The revolution of the 17th century overthrew it. And what it said was, there's no such thing as soul or spirit in matter, in nature. The universe is nothing but a machine proceeding automatically through mechanical forces. The soul was drained out of the whole universe. It was drained out of all animals and plants, so they just became machines. And it was drained out of the human body until all that was left was a small region of the brain in which the intellect was supposed to function or interact with the body. The rest of the body became a machine. This mechanistic metaphor or paradigm, the machine model, has been the dominant model ever since. It's the model that underlies the economics and practice of factory farming, genetic modification, biotechnology. The very words tell you how this is embedded in the present system, and we heard from Judy very movingly about that just now. So this way of looking at nature as a machine, an automatically self-proceeding machine, has been the basis of science ever since. And this vision in the 17th century made a radical distinction between all of nature, including the human body, and the human mind. The human mind was the only thing that was not material in the material world. It was supposed to be an immaterial spirit with an affinity with God and the angels, which were also supernatural or immaterial. And the only thing in nature that had this conscious mind was the human brain. Human beings were alone the conscious beings in the whole universe. The only material beings that had consciousness. And that meant that human beings who had science and technology were the ones who could dominate and control nature for their own good. And this vision of human progress through science and technology, by the end of the 18th century, became the standard ideology of intellectuals in Europe and America. It's the Enlightenment worldview. And it's now been spread to the entire world through the ideology of economic development and economic growth through science and technology. It's brought us many benefits. It's done many good things in the world. The social reforms it's ushered in have been extremely good. I mean, it's done many good things, Enlightenment rationalism, this Enlightenment attitude. But it's rooted in a mechanical view of nature, which we're now superseding. And the crisis in science at the moment is the one between the old paradigm, this mechanistic, materialistic view of the world that says all of nature is just machinery. And the materialists go further than the original mechanists, because they say, well, even the mind, even the human mind, there's no such thing as God and angels. And the only thing that might be an exception, the human mind, isn't an exception at all. It's nothing but the activity of the brain. It's a purely material product, a kind of phosphorescence around the nerve endings. And, when you die, that's it. Nothing can survive. It's just nothing but the activity of the brain. This view, this materialist, atheist view of the world, has recently undergone an enormous revival through the work of Richard Dawkins and others, who've been stomping the US atheist revivalist meetings. And this kind of scientific fundamentalism has found its perfect enemy in the Christian right in America, and creationism, and its more sophisticated version, intelligent design. Both of them are really locked into a 19th century mechanistic view of the world as machinery, animals and plants as machinery. And machines have to have designers. Either there has to be a mechanical God, outside the machine-making God, or natural selection somehow has to do the designing in an entirely unconscious manner. But this is an incredibly old-fashioned debate. It's an extraordinary time warp that sort of hijacked the intellectual life and turned it back at least a century. What's really going on in science is something much more interesting. Science itself is breaking out of this mechanistic view, this view of a dead, mechanical, inanimate, unconscious world. And it's breaking out of it in several different ways. Firstly, we're recognizing that we live on a living planet, Gaia. Everything's interconnected. Global warming and climate change shows that our activities aren't independent of the planet. We're not just dominating nature, we're part of it. We're in it, we're changing it, and it's changing us. And what happens in one country affects what happens in another. We're interconnected. This is something which I think probably everyone in the world now realizes. It's not just a theory, as it was in science 20 or 30 years ago. It's a rediscovery of an insight that's been common to almost every culture throughout the world, including Europe, namely that we live on a living Earth, Mother Earth, and this is our home. But this is now becoming accepted within science and the living Earth. Secondly, atoms, the very stuff of matter, are no longer seen as inanimate particles like little billiard balls. Instead, they're vibratory patterns of activity. They're like tiny organisms, vibrating, indeterminate, and with a life of their own. They're not just inert stuff, they're activities. Then the mechanistic idea that nature is just totally predictable, it's a determinate machine, that's disappeared. Quantum indeterminacies come into quantum theory. The chaos theory has shown us that so much of nature is actually indeterminate, not rigidly programmed, totally determinate. So there's a freedom and a spontaneity that have come back into nature. The old idea that nature was just a machine made by God in the beginning or just made by itself in some unexplained way and then running smoothly ever after has given way to a realization we live in an evolving creative universe. The universe was born very small and very hot, less than the size of a head of a pin, and it's been growing ever since the Big Bang 15 billion years ago, and as it grows, cools down, and as it cools down, new structures, new forms can appear within it. At first there were no zinc atoms or hydrogen atoms or salt crystals or grass or anything. All these things have evolved in time. Planets, stars, and galaxies were not there in the beginning. The whole universe is like a developing organism. Not at all like a meaningless machine. And then, in this evolving universe, a new question arises. The old view was that everything was governed by eternal laws of nature. That nature was supposed to be, the nature of nature was supposed to be fixed. Originally, because it was supposed to have been created by a machine-making God who set all the laws of nature and then pressed the start button. That was the 17th century idea. Then the materialists and the atheists got rid of God, so they said, well, the best way to get rid of God is to make the universe eternal. And in the 19th century, that was the favored theory. You don't need a creator because there's no creation, there's no beginning. But the Big Bang theory shows that there is a kind of beginning. And so this then raises the question about what about the eternal laws of nature? If they're eternal, they must have been there before the universe. If they were there before the universe, then where were they and what are they? And how can this conceivably be thought of as part of hard-nosed physics? This is a kind of Platonic metaphysical view, nothing wrong with it, but it's certainly not hard-nosed, common sense, show me the evidence physics. On the other hand, they may all have come into being at the very instant of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. And as my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle of give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of the entire universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. If the universe evolves, the laws of nature are more likely to evolve than not. And after all, when you think about it, the idea of laws of nature is just a metaphor based on human laws. It's anthropocentric. And instead, in fact, of laws evolving, I think it's best to shift the metaphor, and the way I shift it is to the idea of habits. I think nature depends on evolving habits. And the basis of this habit is what I call morphic resonance. It's the influence of similar things on subsequent similar things. It means that each species has a kind of collective memory. Each individual contributes to it and in turn draws upon it. Even crystals and molecules have memories. All of nature has a memory. This gives us a view of evolution as an endless interplay between the principle of habit, which repeats things. The more often they repeat, the more often they'll happen again. Deep principle of nature, we all know it from our own lives. And creativity, which enables new things to happen. And evolution is an interplay between habit and creativity at the cosmic level, at the biological level, and at the human level, and at the personal level. Every one of us can recognize that in our own lives. That's, I think, the way that science is pointing in showing us the way nature works. Not a kind of blind, pre-designed mechanism, not a system with no inherent creativity, but a wonderful, evolving, creative cosmos that's still evolving, that's still creative. Finally, the biggest problem confronted by the old paradigm mechanistic view is consciousness. What is the nature of the mind? If it doesn't depend on some mysterious, totally undefined substance, spiritual substance, as Descartes called it, if it's just the activity of the brain, then we run into appalling problems. If everything's inside the brain, if all our consciousness is in the brain, it just confronts us with a whole series of paradoxes, and one of them concerns vision, and I'll talk about that in a moment. What I myself suggest, and a number of other people working in the field of consciousness studies, is that we are not compelled to choose between two totally unsatisfactory theories. One, materialism, the mind is nothing but the brain, or dualism, that all of nature is totally mechanical, but there's this mysterious something that interacts with the brain. Descartes thought it happened in the pineal gland. The modern version has moved it a couple of inches into the cerebral cortex, but it's essentially the same theory. No one can say how it works, how it interacts, what it is, how it can be detected. Yet we all know there's more to us than just a mechanical brain of nerve impulses. The weakness of each of these theories is the strength of its opponents. The materialists gain their most strength by criticizing dualism, and the dualists by criticizing materialism. But the way forward, I think, is a third way, which neither sees the mind and the brain as identical nor as totally separate. I think the mind is based on a system of fields, fields of the mind. Our minds are based on fields that stretch out far beyond our brains and bodies. Just as the field of a magnet is inside the magnet and stretches out beyond it, and the field of the earth is inside the earth and stretches out beyond it, and the field of your cell phone is inside the phone and stretches out beyond it invisibly. So our minds are inside our brains and stretch out beyond them. This may seem as if I'm just sort of playing with words, but if you think about a very simple process, what seems simple, vision, it becomes clearer what I'm saying. You're seeing me sitting here right now. What's going on? Well, the standard scientific view tells us that light's reflected from me, goes through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, inverted images on the retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerve, and then changes in various parts of the brain that can be now described in greater detail than ever before, thanks to MRI scanning and other brain scanning techniques. So changes are happening in your brain right now that can be characterized in different parts of the brain, and these can all be measured. But that's what science tells us. But is that an explanation of vision? Well, no. First of all, it doesn't explain the fact that you're conscious of what you're seeing. That's totally out of this picture. It's not part of it. It's what's called in the trade of consciousness studies the hard problem, because no one knows how to solve it. And the place which is the main forum for this debate is Tucson, Arizona, where there's a big conference every 2 years called Toward a Science of Consciousness. And God willing, I'm hoping to go there next week, where I'm giving a keynote. But that's one of the places where this big problem has been debated most intensively. And the more you look at the materialist picture, it's nothing but the brain, the less sense it makes. So think of vision. You're seeing me consciously. There's no explanation for the consciousness, even though we can scan the brain in all this detail. But secondly, and simpler, you're, I imagine, seeing me sitting right here on the stage. You're not experiencing me as being a miniaturized Rupert inside your brain. Yet science is telling us that that's what is actually happening. You're generating a kind of virtual reality display in a mysterious manner inside your brain. There's a tiny me somewhere inside your head. And then in a kind of illusory manner, you imagine I'm actually out here. And if you look at the sky at night, you see the sky. That must be inside your head too, if all consciousness is in the brain. So that means that if the sky's inside your head, your skull must be beyond the sky. That's the standard view. When you take it to its logical limit, it doesn't make sense. I'm proposing a different theory, one that's so simple it's hard to grasp, which is that your image of me is located right here, exactly where it seems to be, outside your brain, outside your body. It's produced by your mind. You're not seeing, what you're seeing is a construction of your mind, the image of me or the image of anything else you see. But it's located where it seems to be. You project out these images. The light comes in, changes happen in the brain, the images are projected out. And the whole of the world around us is filled with these projections of our minds. It's filled with the projections of the minds of animals and indeed of any creature with an image-forming eye. It's filled with invisible projections, just as it's filled with invisible TV broadcasts and cell phone transmissions. So that I call the extended mind, and our minds connect us to the environment the entire time. They're not just confined to our bodies. We're interconnected with the world around us. There's evidence for this. I won't talk about it this evening, but very simply, if you look at somebody else, if your mind reaches out to touch what you're looking at, you might affect someone by looking at them. Can people tell if they're being looked at from behind when they don't know you're there? Answer, over 90% of the population have had that experience, the sense of being stared at. I've done scientific tests that show this is for real. It's a kind of taboo topic within institutional science until recently, because it simply doesn't fit in. It ought not to happen. And yet, everybody, even every child, knows about this phenomenon. This is one of the mysteries of everyday life that we've been forced to deny in order to fit our understanding into this cramping framework of the mechanistic dogma that it's nothing but the brain. And we can escape from that. There are many other ways in which we can do it. But I just want now to say briefly something about the other great frontier of modern science. Consciousness studies and developmental biology are one, but the other is cosmology. Cosmology, through the Big Bang, has revealed to us that we live in this creative, huge, expanding universe, 15 billion years old. The more we discover about it, the more mysterious it becomes. About 30 years ago, scientists discovered that the majority of the universe was utterly unknown to us. It was called dark matter. No one knew what it was and what it did. They had to postulate it was there to explain the way galaxies hold together. It was as if science had discovered the cosmic unconscious. We can only know a certain amount about the cosmos, but what really makes it tick was utterly obscure to us and still is. More recently, they've discovered something called dark energy, which is causing the universe to expand. Dark energy is equally mysterious, and put together dark matter and dark energy, and they amount to more than 95% of the universe. The universe we actually know about is less than 5%. And this is not an eccentric theory put forward by one or two wild-eyed theorists or occultists. This is standard stuff taught in every department of cosmology today. This is the accepted view among mainstream scientists. We just don't know how the universe works. The arrogance and pride of the 19th century in thinking they practically got the whole thing figured out. We're discovering we really don't know. 95% is utterly unknown to us. There's all sorts of theories about this. No one knows what it is, how it's working. One of the biggest assumptions of cosmology is that the entire cosmos is entirely unconscious and devoid of mind. This is the materialistic, mechanistic view. People just assumed that the cosmos was just blind matter in motion. But what if they're wrong? If our minds can be conscious, if our brains can support consciousness, the physical activity of our brains, and as science shows us, more specifically, the electromagnetic patterns of rhythmic activity inside our brains seem to be an interface with consciousness. If that interface between the physical world and consciousness can occur in human brains, might it not occur somewhere else in the universe? There are, in fact, things in the universe vastly more complex than our brains, with vastly more complex electromagnetic patterns of activity. And the nearest and most obvious is the sun. The more we know about the sun, the more we know that it's incredibly complex in its pattern of activity. Could the sun be conscious? Could the sun have a mind? And if the sun has, what about the other stars? Could the galaxy have a mind? Could we live in a conscious universe? I think we could. In fact, I think we do. And I think as we come to this realization, we'll realize that science has actually opened up to us, in spite of its cramped limitations of an old dogma that it's outgrowing, has opened up to us a vast new vision. And it's one where science and spirituality can come and explore together, working together rather than in opposition, opening up us a whole new sense of our interconnectedness, meaningfulness, and relationship to the cosmos in which we live. So that's far too far in the future to influence the next American election. So in the spirit of this, I'm going to end with a simple practical proposal. This is, if you like, from the sublime to the ridiculous, but I think science has gone wrong in the sense it's sort of become boring, it's become rather dead, it's become conformist. It's now almost entirely dependent on funding from corporations and governments. Scientists live in fear of not getting their grants renewed. You have to be very conservative to get a grant. Really innovative, creative work just isn't getting funded at the moment. And what's more, the kind of science that's done is unrelated to what most people are really interested in. For example, I do research on, among other things, on telepathic dogs, dogs that know when their owners are coming home. There's a huge public interest in this, but there's never one penny of public funding ever been spent on this kind of research. And why not? I mean, it's a totally interesting, fascinating topic. My proposal is this, that 1% of science funding, of government science funding, goes to pay for research that actually interests taxpayers. The other 99% would be spent as at present. And to find out what interests people, ask. For the very first time, the principles of democracy could be introduced into the world of science. And people could be asked what they'd like to see, individuals, but also organizations like the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, and so on. There are many organizations, trades unions, women's local groups, schools. All sorts of people could have ideas. I proposed this idea in the New York Times first, and then in Nature and in New Scientist. And in Europe, it's been taken quite seriously. I've discussed it with several leading members of Parliament. I discussed it with the Shadow Minister of Science. Quite a lot of people think it's important because their governments in Europe are very worried about public alienation from science. People see science as a hostile force working in the interests of sinister corporations to dominate and control the world. And so they're really worried about this, and they've come to the conclusion what's needed is public participation in science. I agree with them, and here's a way it could actually happen. This was discussed on BBC Radio, on their main news programme, and they talked to the Minister of Science about it, and they talked to a number of other people. And then they, in a rather brilliant stroke, they interviewed a woman who had an organic garden. And they said to her, what would you like to know if you could ask questions of scientists? She said, well, I'm trying to grow carrots, and they get root fly. And someone told me if I put grass cuttings on the soil, I could stop carrot root fly. I'd like to know if that's true. They then went and talked to the head of the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, which dispenses more than £1 billion a year for biological research, and asked if they were doing any research on carrots and root fly in organic gardens. And he said, oh, of course not. It's not the kind of thing we're looking into sequencing genomes, genetic modification of foods. And so, the disjunction between an ordinary, simple question that would actually cause a real, literally grassroots interest in science, and what's really going on, there's this huge gulf. And I think a scheme in which 1% of science funding were open to public participation would help to re-engage the public, interest young people, make science exciting again. And if it worked, it would be an experiment. If it worked, it could be extended to 5%, 10%, 20%. We could have a completely different way of doing science. So I think, in spite of the fact many people see science as boring, life-denying, and even sinister, there's a lot of hope there, and we need that hope because whether we like it or not, our civilization is based on science. And unless we can find a new and more hopeful way of doing science, I don't think we've got many ways out of the situation we're in. Thank you.
I went to dinner last night at Tulip with Judy and Rupert. No, Rupert was in the hospital. He was on my mind. So it's as if I was in the hospital with Rupert and at the restaurant with Judy and Randy. There were tulips in the hospital, and the restaurant was named Tulip. And there was a tulip on the table. And Randy looked at the red tulip on the table, which had that kind of almost closed tulip look. And he said, I didn't used to like tulips. We were just, we knew each other, but it was our first, we were meeting to discuss, so we needed to have a little preliminary conversation before we launched into Optimistic Voices election year. How can we change the world? Things are really dire, but we have to talk about hope. Why were we thinking that? Things have to get better. How are we going to make that happen? Are people coming? Are people not coming? Is Rupert coming? He's in the hospital. Tulips. We wanted to be nice, friendly, create a warm atmosphere. And so we tried to say, right, they look kind of stiff, waxy. They might be imported. The waiter came and asked if we wanted water. He was very tall, well-dressed. He was so tall he had to duck when he went in and out of the room where we were eating to the room where the food was going to come from. He said, do you want bottled water? Or do you want tap? Randy looked at me with this look, this dagger. I said, don't use that word, dagger. Fine. Ooh. We were not allowed to order bottled water, even though the tap water might kill us. The bottled water was also killing us. That is the hard problem. The appalling problem, the appalling set of problems, is that they were both deadly in their own unique way. A kind of invisible way. Because the bottled water came in plastic, it trucked, flown, fossil fuels, peak oil, tragedy, because of me, because I was going to order the no, tap. I'm a martyr, I'll die from some invisible, Then he asked if we wanted wine. At that point, it seemed terribly permissible. We'll have the Syrah from South Africa. Where do you draw the line? Randy said he didn't mind tulips anymore, but he still preferred daffodils. And I said, yes, they're very cheery-uppy, aren't they? He said, yes, I don't know why. But I've put them in my bathroom, and every time I go into the bathroom, and there they're sitting on the back of the toilet or the side of the tub, and there they are, daffodils. I get a little bit, even if it's hard, and the hard problem, and the appalling, and the happy. Thought out Rupert in his hospital bed. Bread. Make your own. At least know who makes it. A person with a name, dusty, flowered hands, wearing a white apron, and he's kneading it. And you can feel the motion of the kneading. You roll and you push with the palm of your hand, and you roll back and you fold, and he has a name, and you want to take him home. But instead you take home the warm loaf. And as you bite into it, you're thinking of Roger, Tom, Timothy, Juanita. Where was I? Tulips. Daffodils. I've planted bulbs for the first time in my life because I bought a house for the first time in my life at exactly the wrong time. And they're actually, you put the bulb in, but you have to be very careful, I realized, to put the rooty little part on the bottom. So that the little tippy part where the little green shoot pushes through the soil, if you don't put it too far down in the ground, a little bit towards the surface, and not before but after the cold. There's the frost. It helps keep them in a paper bag in between in the dark. They like the dark. And little hairy is the root part. You put that down first, and the little pointy part, and it shouldn't have the green yet, so you have to figure out what that is, and you put it in there, you put a little bit of dirt over it, and if you're religious, you pray, and if you're not religious, you think about praying. And if you've read those books from Russia, you put Mozart on. And even if you don't, they grow. It's the most amazing thing. I wake up in the morning and I look out my window at the big 200-year-old oak tree, which is why I bought the house. It is now mine. How can a 200 oak be mine? I protest the entire. It does not belong to me, but it is now mine. I had to trim it. All around my 200-year-old oak tree. Mine. You are mine. I love you. I love you. You belong to me. I'm paying for you. For a while. Then I'll die and you'll keep growing and someone else will pay for you. Unless things change and we'll just share you. You will belong to the neighborhood you already do. Daffodils. I look out the window in the morning and the sun is hitting the flowers. And some of them are yellow with a dark yellow center. And some of them are yellow with this pale yellow center. Fa! So I have the pew and the fa and the pew and the fa and the pew, fa, pew, fa, pew. And they're catching the sun. And I swear to God, they're heliocentric, heliotropic, helio. And they've turned. They haven't turned like, I can't explain it. They turn in the moment of being lit. They do this slight, like a cartoon. They become animated and translucent and phosphorescent. And they are worshiping the sun. I swear to God, even if there is no God, there's something, and they're praying to it, and they've turned, and they're translucent, and they are madly in love. And I'm watching like a voyeur out my bedroom window at this mad love affair between daffodil and sun. And I'm happy. For a moment. That's before I read the newspaper, which I don't read. That was a lie just to make a point. But I feel that other people are reading the newspaper because I have an extended mind. It is traveling out all over the neighborhood. There are people in Starbucks reading the newspaper. There used to be a woman in the neighborhood where I rented my house before I decided to take the big leap into home ownership. Ha! I can do it. I think. I put on a new roof. I won't talk about that. I'm just going to put a little basket out. When you leave, you can... No coins. Right. I have a non-profit. Stop, Nina. Stop. Go back. Happy Daffodils Extended News. Where am I? In the garden. Oh my God, I have my own garden. I planted radishes. You put this little tiny seed in your hand. You can hardly see it if you're my age. And you put something in the soil, you don't know what. You have a paid gardener who figures stuff like that out. And you just show up when it's time to put the little tiny, minuscule little, I do not believe this could possibly turn into anything seed into the ground. And you put a little bit of dirt over it. The dirt's been treated with more dirt. You've bought dirt. Carried the dirt up, more dirt on the old dirt because it likes the new dirt, because the new dirt's better. You can tell it's better because it's darker and it's moist and it's rich and it smells like dirt. You want to just kneel down and eat the dirt. You want to take off your clothes and roll in the dirt because you've missed dirt for so long you don't even know it. But something in your extended mind knows you long for dirt. You want to be dirty, under your fingernails dirt. Put it all over you, mud dirt. But instead you don't because someone's watching you. Just put the seed in. In that little minuscule thing, because you've watered it, not by hand, automatic, just does it by itself. Turns into first this little green shoot, and then darker leaves that get broader. And one day you go into your backyard and you see the little head of the radish pushing through the soil. And you realize you can eat it. How did that little tiny seed know how to do that? Extended mind! It is not in the seed. It cannot possibly be tiny little. It has to be. He's right. Even if he's wrong, he's right. Because I eat it! And it tasted like a radish. There was a woman in the neighborhood where I rented. Her name was Maria. She was Italian. And her entire yard, from front to back, in every little square inch of available dirt, had been transformed into this enormous, intensive garden. Like everything was all smushed together, friendly. They don't mind being close together and living with each other like those pigs wanting to sleep in a pile. Oh. The little lettuces all in the basil I initially began walking to her house when I needed food. And she would take you around her garden with her head wrapped in a scarf and her rubber little booties on, and little cutting implements in her hand. She didn't speak English. She was Italian, so you could just point. Over there, that one. And she kneeled down, and she would cut that particular bouquet of lettuce. That one over there, cilantro. That over there, basil. That over there, Italian green beans. And her smile was so broad, and her teeth so solid, and her happiness, even though you don't want to use that word when you're writing because it's a bad word to use, it's vague, and it's still palpable. And she would take it all into her little basement shop, where she had a scale where everything was weighed by putting a little weight on one side. And then the scale would balance. The scale would balance. The scale of, on my way here, I wasn't feeling, my feet were, and there's so much to do, and suddenly I had to go visit Maria's scale would balance. And she would add up 5 cents for that particular lettuce, 2 cents for that bean, on a little piece of brown paper bag with a pencil, and add it up in her head. And you'd give her money, but you really felt like falling to your knees and kissing her feet. Then I would go, not because I needed food, but because I needed cheering up. And I would walk to her house, and we would go around her garden, and she would have that smile, that huge smile. She hardly had any money because all you gave her was little bits of coins and paper, but she had that garden. I would go when I had PMS. I would take my friends when they had PMS. And we would go to Maria's garden, and we would point at vegetables, and everything would start to balance. My friend Catherine Sneed told me a story. She was working in the prison, and there was this big, empty, vacant lot full of detritus, old syringes, bits of Barbie dolls with their heads plucked off, condoms, used tampons, car parts, old household furniture missing its legs, broken glass, because there's always broken glass in vacant lots, shimmering kind of like diamonds. But actually, because somebody's taken a bat and mashed it through somebody's Lexus. Because they shouldn't be driving a Lexus. It uses too much gas. We have a hard, appalling problem. And she decided that they needed a garden for the prison. So she went through all the bureaucracy until she finally got permission, 500,000 signatures, begging, telephone calls. All the food was shipped in this little pre-packaged cartons of unidentifiable colors of Jell-O. Sort of mashed food, the kind you eat in hospitals that they call food, but you actually don't recognize it. Prison food is like hospital food, airplane food. There seems to be some odd paradigm in need of a shift. So she got permission, and first they took out all the trash, and then they brought in soil. All the guys were let out for a few hours in their dark orange suits. And they started planting a garden. And they planted cauliflower and carrots and lettuce. And they hadn't ever done that before. And there's a film about this, and this big guy with big muscles and a shaved head and tattoos, the kind of guy you might want to marry, or you might just want to cross the street when he walks by. Only a few women in the audience got that joke. I learned that from Eddie Izzard and immediately incorporating it. More laughter once I acknowledged the joke and made another joke on top of that joke that elucidated the joke from another point. The prisoner's... He's looking at the camera, and he's talking about carrots with that little frilly top. And he's saying that he watered the carrot, and the carrot grew. And he fell in love with the carrot. So when he was released from prison, he committed another crime so he could come back to the garden. He said, nothing ever needed me before. And nothing responded to my care before. I needed the carrots. And a big tear started making its way down his cheek because he was remembering those frilly, lacy carrot tops. She started a garden outside of the prison, and there was this big vacant lot in Hunter's Point, a really dangerous part of town. She tried to get permission to plant trees in the park, but the bureaucracy was taking too long. So one day she just bought a bunch of bare root trees, put them in her, is that right, bare root? Trees with roots that are showing. And she climbed over the fences with these guys who are now ex-cons. And they started digging holes in the vacant lot to put in the tree and plant it. She looked up and there was a small boy, about 7 years old, with a gun in his hand. And he was pointing it at her. And these ex-cons who'd grown up in the same neighborhood started to scatter because they knew what guns could do. And they backed off, and she turned around, and they weren't there anymore, and she was alone with this child with a gun, and she thought, I'm going to die right here planting a tree. And suddenly one of the men came forward because he recognized the boy. Because he'd grown up in the same neighborhood, a violent and dangerous, poor, African-American neighborhood. And he said, I know your aunt. Is it your aunt named Margot? And the boy looked up, recognized. And another man walked forward and he said, I know your aunt too. Isn't your mother named Nancy? And the boy looked up, recognized. His mother was a drug dealer, his aunt crack cocaine, the whole prostitute story. No care at home, not fed well. I want to kill you, and that's why, but no one understands the reason. All the men started coming towards the boy until one of them said, what's your name? And the boy told him his name. My friend Catherine said, do you want to plant the tree? And another man said, give me the gun. And the boy knelt down on that earth and he planted the tree. I know who your mother is. And look up there, there's Venus. And that daffodil will grow in your garden. And when you look at it and the sun hits it and it all goes translucent, it's because no one will tell you, but it's because of love. He planted the tree, he tamped down the earth, and then they poured water on that tree so that tree could grow. And that boy did not go to jail because he was connected, because someone knew who he was and knew who his mother was and knew that daffodils loved sun and knew that if you took that tiny seed, it contained the entire universe. You get on your knees. You do not wear gloves. You let your hands touch the dirt, and you sprinkle just a little bit, fine dirt, over that tiny, tiny seed. And it grows into a radish. And when you bite it, you taste radish. And you know that somehow the radish and the taste of radish is you completing the equation for that radish to be fulfilled in this life. And that is the equation for love, that burst of radish in your mouth. And for a moment, you know, you belong here, a part of everything.